Ecco, io vorrei sottolineare soltanto qualche punto di avvio del discorso su Fontana. Qui la mostra è sostanzialmente di dipinti. Fontana è stato pittore dalla fine degli anni 40, tra 49 e 50, fino alla sua morte.
So this exhibition is on Fontana's painting mostly. He was a painter from the end of the 50s until his death.
Però la storia di Fontana comincia negli anni 20 e comincia come scultore.
But the story of Fontana started in the 20s and he started as a sculptor.
Qui di scultura ce n'è soltanto una molto importante,
Here there's only one sculpture, albeit very important,
che è il cavallo nero, che dovrebbe essere, per ora non si è accettata la data esatta, ma dovrebbe essere dell'inizio della seconda metà degli anni 30.
So it's the black horse that you saw upstairs, which should be, although we're not exactly sure about the date, but it should be from the beginning of the second half of the 30s.
E pone una questione molto importante riguardo al fatto di aver praticato allora Fontana negli anni 30 e poi in parte all'inizio dei 40 in ceramica, prima in gesso per ragioni anche pratiche, in terracotta colorata, in gesso colorato, una scultura colorata. Il grande merito di Fontana scultore è stato quello di portare avanti nell'avanguardia la possibilità della scultura colorata.
So what is very notable about his sculpture from the 30s, 40s is that it was colored.
Il nero va preso come colore.
Black has to be taken as a color as opposed to white. And even in his terracotta, in his gesso experiments, they were always colored, which is the most notable thing about Fontana's sculpture.
Idealmente questo cavallo nero si rifà all'uomo nero con il quale Fontana ha esordito in maniera rivoluzionaria nel 30-31.
So this horse, this black horse, is a reference to the black man, l'uomo nero.
Uomo nero, sì.
Which was an important image for Fontana in the 1930s, 40s.
Ecco, la scultura antica era colorata, la scultura classica era tutta colorata. È stato il Rinascimento e poi il neoclassicismo che ha immaginato che la scultura fosse invece senza colore, cioè il marmo bianco e così via.
So antique sculptures were of course colored. It's only at the Renaissance that they were believed to be white.
Negli anni 10 Arcipenco, nel quadro delle ricerche plastiche cubiste, ha immaginato di portare il colore nella scultura.
So it's around 1910 that he imagined around the cubist experiments to bring color into sculpture.
E questo però non ha avuto un grande seguito e invece ha avuto una ripresa importante negli anni 30 attraverso la ceramica, la scultura in ceramica.
And it wasn't followed up very much in the 1910s, but in the 30s it was noticed with his ceramics. This is when his work with sculpture and color with sculpture became important.
Quando Fontana nel 36-37 lavorava tra Parigi e Sèvres, ha dichiarato: io non sono un ceramista, sono uno scultore. Però era uno scultore in ceramica, uno scultore quindi colorato.
So it's in 1936, 1937 when Lucio Fontana was working in Sèvres that he declared, I'm not a ceramist, I am a sculptor. I am a ceramic sculptor, and that makes my sculpture be able to be colored.
E negli anni 30 Fontana è stato un grande protagonista della scultura d'avanguardia europea in termini di scultura colorata.
And so in the 30s he was one of the main figures of the avant-garde of the 1930s for colored sculptures.
Il cavallo nero è nero come colore.
The black horse is black as a color.
Ecco, il secondo aspetto che mi sembra molto importante e rivoluzionario di Fontana comincia invece alla fine tra 49 e 50, quando comincia a bucare la tela.
The second aspect and the second revolutionary aspect of Lucio Fontana's work started in the late 40s, early 50s, when he started to make holes in the canvases.
È un atto rivoluzionario se pensiamo che tutto il problema delle avanguardie storiche, a partire dal post-impressionismo, è stata la conquista della superficie.
So it was a revolutionary act because everything post-impressionist was the conquest of the surface, and with the whole, he really pushed this idea.
In particolare Malevich e Mondrian sono la padronanza assoluta della superficie. L'immagine astratta, la struttura o anche al limite la figura nascono a partire dalla tela, non indicando uno spazio al di là, uno spazio un altrove.
So Malevich,
prospetti.
Mondrian were the absolute masters of the surface. They conquered the surface within itself. They didn't create a third dimension. They completely affirmed the surface of the canvas.
Ecco, questa superficie che è stata la grande conquista dell'arte contemporanea nella prima metà del secolo scorso, Fontana, con una disinvoltura assoluta che è da scultore che dipinge, la buca, passa oltre.
And so Fontana, with his whole, goes beyond this conquest of the surface of the canvas and breaks
cerca,
the avant-garde of the first half of the 20th century.
Cerca un'altra dimensione spaziale.
He's looking for a new spatial dimension.
Che è una dimensione di infinito. E in questo senso il terzo punto che vorrei sottolineare è il rapporto ideale ma consapevole che Fontana aveva da una parte con il futurismo italiano e dall'altra parte con il barocco.
And so it's a search for the possibility of an infinite dimension, and this links him to the futurists, the Italian futurists of the time, as well as with Baroque art.
Riguardo al futurismo, a parte un riferimento ideale a Boccioni che spesso fa Fontana, c'è un rapporto preciso alla fine degli anni 30.
So for the futurism, there's a specific report that Fontana makes with Boccioni, but it also refers to futurism from the end of the 1930s.
E avviene proprio attraverso la pratica della ceramica, attraverso l'attività ad Albissola insieme a Tullio d'Albissola.
And so this comes about through his ceramics and through his activity with Albissola.
Ed è un rapporto con quello che Enrico Prampolini, che è il grande protagonista del futurismo fra anni 20 e 30, e chiamava idealismo cosmico.
And this is an idea that's called cosmic idealism by Pampolini, who was a great futurist from the end of the 30s.
Bucando la tela e cercando uno spazio infinito, in qualche modo Fontana si ricollegava a questa proiezione cosmica dell'immaginario di Prampolini.
So by making a hole in the canvas in a certain way, Fontana made a link with the imagination of a cosmos by Pampolini.
Per quanto riguarda il barocco, che Fontana stesso cita, basta pensare soprattutto a Bernini e a questo senso plastico della dimensione plastica dell'ambiente, la proiezione ambientale.
So in regards to the Baroque, one can think about Bernini and the plastic dimension of an environment, the plastic dimension of the object, which Fontana is very interested in.
Ecco, questi secondo me sono 3 spunti fondamentali per inquadrare, almeno come avvio di discorso, di riflessione, l'opera di Fontana.
And these are the 3 main points that allow us to sort of have an approach to Fontana's work.
Grazie.
That Fontana, in addition to being an Italian artist, was an Argentinian artist. Let me explain what I mean. The Latin American art world were early adopters of the new, and they had very, very few roots in tradition, or at least in European tradition. What the majority of them, those who were operating in places which had great Indian cultures, notably Mexico did, was that they veered towards a mixture of modernity and ethnicity. That didn't happen in Argentina, partly because, of course, Argentina had not been an area inhabited by great, well-organized Indian kingdoms. So there's a kind of libertarianism in much Argentine art. And this libertarianism, this insouciance about the nature of the past, is, I think, one of the factors you have to take into account when you're looking at Fontana's work. You also have to remember that Fontana did not spend his complete career in Italy, though he is identified now as an Italian artist. As a young man, he was already a mature artist in Buenos Aires, working under the shadow of his father, who was an Italian immigrant and a well-known sculptor. Then he had a period in Europe, in the interwar period, where he was associated with the Abstraction Création group, led by Urbain and Georges Ventangelo, and including all sorts of big names, such as Mondrian. But he certainly wasn't a major figure in it. He then returned to Buenos Aires during World War II, and only came back to Europe in 1947 when the war was over. He then had to make his reputation all over again. So one of the things I'm saying is that Fontana was, for an important avant-garde artist, a remarkably late starter. The Fontana you see, the Fontana you know, the Fontana we're talking about, really begins when he was really almost 50. And it's the last 20 years of his life, which really count. Now, there are comparisons which everybody lightly makes about Fontana linked to, in comparison with, certain phenomena in the last phase of modernism in Europe in the 1960s, 50s, 60s. They compare him to Yves Klein for radical simplicity. But Yves Klein, you must remember, always preserved the unity of the surface. They compare him sometimes to what was going on here in London, the so-called Destruction in Art group, led by Gustav Metzger. But you've got to remember that Gustav Metzger is still alive, was born in 1926. Fontana was born in 1899. He was much older, and he would have been, if Metzger had known about him, something of a father figure. If you look at arti povera, which is the comparison which most people run to when talking about Fontana's work, well, arti povera held its first major exhibition in 1967 in Genoa. By that time, Fontana was very nearly at the end of his career. If there was any influence, it was from him to them. Boetti to Boetti, perhaps, that kind of thing. So you have to really look at it in a different way, see Fontana as a pioneering original with a somewhat different background to the Italians of his generation, and ask yourself what he was trying to do and why he was trying to do it. Well, what happens there is that if you look at the modern movement in those years, the 50s and 60s, it was already entering into a period of crisis. The crisis appears most violently in America, where you have the conflict between pop art and what became minimalism. Minimalism, artists like Judd, for example, they were extremely puritanical. Art had to be about nothing but art. It was the aesthetic situation only which mattered. You didn't look outside, or all of this kind of thing. And eventually, as we know, that development ran into buffers, and you got something else which, for want of a better term, began to be called postmodernism. That is, those developments were defined by what they were not by what they were. I don't think Fontana thought like the American minimalists. But I do think that he had certain things in common with them. The thing he had in common was that he wanted to make the art object of any kind, and that included the painting as well, so-called, as well as the sculpture. He wanted to make it into a self-sufficient object. That is, it's the object quality which he was looking to create. He certainly was not aiming to represent anything, echo anything, all of that kind of thing. But I think he probably also wanted to disturb. It's disturbing to see an avant-garde artwork which has been apparently attacked, like this one. Well, what can one ask oneself about the context? Here I'm staring away from the text I prepared, but it's something which has begun to occur to me more and more as I looked at pictures again this morning. What did he find in the Italy he returned to? Well, one of the things he found was a situation where famous monuments had been attacked, were crumbling, were the victims of war. I think one of the things we ought to think about here, and it moves very much away from purely aesthetic doctrine, pure minimalism, is that what we're looking at is wounded artworks, if I may coin a phrase. It's the wound which counts. The artwork works in two ways. One is the slashes, the punctures, all that kind of thing, suggests that it is a fully three-dimensional object, that you have to think not only of the surface but about what lies behind the surface. But also the whole myth of damage, if I can call it that way, seems to me important. And in that way he is looking forward to dealing with the imperfections of the world. Minimalism assumes that you can make a totally self-enclosed aesthetic universe. This, I think, assumes that you can't, that you're doing the opposite, and that the artwork is in dialogue with the situation that surrounds it. And that is, in a way, things which point forward quite a long way. Down the road here, we have a great retrospective exhibition devoted to the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. And Ai Weiwei, because of the influence of the internet, where he's one of the savviest practitioners, has become perhaps the most famous artist to exist, living artist to exist internationally. He is, in fact, the Kardashian of the art world. But at the same time, I think Ai Weiwei does acknowledge the idea of damage. That is, if you look at one of the principal works in the Academy exhibition, what does it consist of? It consists of a great pile of iron rods. These iron rods were sourced from buildings damaged in the Sichuan earthquake of 2008, which killed thousands of people. Well, and then straightened out, then put in a pile on the floor of one of the galleries at the Royal Academy. Well, that's not a minimal artwork. It's an artwork very definitely with a context. And I think we are looking at, in many ways, at the same kind of contextualization here. So what I would like to say is Fontana combines a number of very interesting things. First of all, he is an outsider in the sense that he is an Italian speaker, a person of Italian heritage, who doesn't quite come from Italy. Let me say, from personal circumstances my own, I empathize with this. I'm English, identified by you as such, but as it happens, I was born in Jamaica. My father's family have lived in Jamaica since 1635. We have a continuous heritage there. Guess what? I came to England when I was age 13. I still don't feel completely English. I look at them and I think, God, aren't they odd? So I think I have a vibe of identification with what Fontana did. The other thing is, next thing to think of, as this gallery, an excellent new space, really extremely well arranged, if I may say so. Why does Fontana seem at home here? Well, not simply because it's an Italian home, but because there's a marriage of two kinds of instinctive elegance. He is an elegant artist. Elegance has become somewhat unfashionable, but I think we all instinctively respond to it. And the third thing is that I think he is a much more radical pioneer than he is often thought of or acknowledged to be. The comparisons I have suggested, the various links you might make, they are pretty well all of them of younger artists, of artists who came after him. That is, when he returned to Italy, when he finally remade himself as a leading avant-gardist, not really like anybody else, he was doing stuff which nobody else was doing. Thank you.
I'm afraid there's not so much left. I would focus on 2 points, and actually I'll use your suggestions, both of Lucie-Smith and Crispolti. I do rather think that Fontana was one-of-a-kind artist and completely an outsider, so unlabelable artist. Anyway, that's what leads him to a kind of confusion. Even spazialismo, which was a kind of a movement that nobody knew since, let's say, 15 years ago, is not easy to define. And what's the spazialismo? Spazialismo is Fontana itself, like they're saying on the manifesto, but spazialismo is also a group of, and I would say, a group of artists that were youngest artists that were following, almost adoring Fontana's ideas more than works. Then we can go on and on hours on defining them, paintings, objects, or sculptures. And another term I would add briefly to Fontana would be ambiguity, in the terms that you can't really say if the work, which works on the third dimension, space, another dimension, it's a sculpture or a painting. Fontana himself in 1950 I think, after some of the work you see upstairs, the brownish and yellowish stones and baroques you see upstairs, writes down, am I a sculptor, am I a painter? So this question mark still goes on and on and on, and that was also what actually inspired a certain critic in order to label him into some movement like informel or, you know, avant-garde abstraction, but they couldn't really actually close him into a precise label. It's true, and I really agree with that, that Fontana arrived in 1947 back to Italy and find the old city, especially Milan, where he was back, completely destroyed. But also, it's also true that there's a very famous, I think that Marcelo, that Deja, the artist, used it also, that photo. There's a photo, very well-known photography of Fontana climbing on his former studio rooms in Milan, having, I think, Fausto Melotti on his right, together with him, and kind of I think, kind of getting some inspiration out of that ruins, as you said before. But also, I would add what Enrico Crispolti said before. He had within his work and his mentality and his former, when you mentioned abstraction, création, and so on, within his work and his mind and his idea, Fontana had also this futuristic emphasis, energy that lead him to react to destruction. So I would say that Fontana gets the idea of the ruins of the city destroyed and the incredible drama that the Second World War was. And in Italy, for Italians especially, fascism and the city completely destroyed by who? But also this incredible energy that he belonged, it was actually a pioneer because he belonged in what we call the 50s in Italy, which were an incredible decade with the 62 in order of rebirth. So when I see Fontana back to this destroyed Milan, I also see Fontana, as you mentioned before, as a completely new avant-garde artist that got energy back from the 30s, but put it in the new direction. And I think at that point, as Crispolti said, you got that kind of cosa hai detto tu che lui lo fa, questi buchi li fa con una grande hai detto non semplicità, hai detto che lui disinvoltura. And I think, well, I can't translate disinvoltura though, sans gêne. but I think but easily as a sculptor could do. So I would focus on two works here, actually upstairs, of course, going back to my beloved works on paper. Again, another material, and Fontana is not only a draughtsman, but it's a sculptor working with different materials, as you can see here. And he works also in the way the material reacts to his ideas. So I'm referring to the work Concetto Spaziale 1952 upstairs. It's a kind of a Cinderella-ish work, usually, because it stays in between these, alpha-dominant works from Baroque to stones and to the other, and with another works on paper that actually paper laid on canvas. Are very significant, again, in this double idea of reconstructing a new Italian idea of, I would say, avant-garde. Because these work like this, and the halls from 1949 to 1951-52, that were used for this incredible, not so well-known research of Fontana did for the first 2 years of the 1950s, which are the research on TV. Fontana ended up on May 1952, together with the other spazialisti, with a manifesto on TV. So thinking that TV was starting in Italy only in 1954 in some towns, in 1956, Fontana was really a pioneer on these very avant-garde technique we use that media, but also technique. So what you could read on the manifesto, which of course was one of the series after the Manifesto Bianco, which was completely written by Fontana's students in Argentina. And Fontana brought the Manifesto Bianco with him on the boat till Genoa, etc., etc. So the other manifesto is on the TV, and Fontana says that a manifestation of life, of space, can actually live forever if it's well thought and well distributed in everywhere, spread all over. So these works were used like screens. So Fontana in a dark room was projecting light on the back or on the surface of these works. And I actually ask you to go upstairs, and it's a little thing, I was discussing it with Alessandra Mamì before, but it's a subtle particular thing, but it's very important. So the paper is laid on canvas. Usually we think that Fontana, it's going like this, with piercing the canvas, but these works are done backwards. So Fontana is actually striking them from the back. And so you have these holes that are projecting themselves outside, because he needed to project the light through the holes and turn these shields, these objects, not these paintings, these objects, these shields, these screens, towards the wall in order to film the light going through the holes and in motion. So at that point, the filming of the light going through these work would become the work of art, and actually leading forever, and actually joining all the family at the same moment all over the world. That was his idea. So I think that it's very important, this idea of the fantasy of Fontana, the idea of not just a materialistic limit. Of course, then, you know, the fetish exists, the object exists, the sculpture exists. My father was a good sculptor. I wanted to be a sculptor. I would like to be a painter too. Like my grandfather, but I realized that these specific art terms are not for me, and I felt like a special artist. That exactly. A butterfly in space excites my imagination. Having freed myself from rhetoric, I lose myself in time and begin my holes. And that's, you know, 1949 until until 1946. He was not talking about painting anymore. Another 2 notes. Do I have 5 minutes more? Yeah, 5 minutes more, then we all get coffee. There's another work which is actually physically too big to be a Cinderella work, but that I could see is actually drawn away by the strength of these incredible fine di Dio, which we all love, but it's, you know, it's becoming kind of the, you know, Black Death in Star Wars. It's getting too important. So I'm talking about the big, incredible teatrino, the black teatrino on the left of the facing the fine di Dio. I've been working on the teatrini back in the 90s, and that's another series of work of Fontana. So how many series? So we have the 30s, we have the 40s, we have the Argentinians, we have the whole, and they're all together. So it's 1965, and it's incredible. So there's a sentence of Fontana saying, when I create these forms, these shapes, and again, look at these kind of bulbs, these round shapes upstairs that reminds you the nature, or you know, the lacquered wood shapes in front of the holes. It says, and I think when I do these shapes, I think about the new man floating in the space, finding himself lost in these unknown, enormous, infinite space. And I think I'm also working to find new forms and new assets for the human mentality in this space. So that's also spatialism. So 1965, again, the multiplicity, contemporarily, series together on Fontana, and 1965, that work there with frieze, lashes and lacquered part, which is not a frame, it's part of the work. That's very important. So they do belong to the same period, so to the same age. The deepness, the floating forms of the teatrino, and reminds me the teatrino, the shapes of the lamps in front of the, in front of the theatre, of the stage, and the incredibly elegant, as you say, elegant. It's also a very dangerous terms, which is very uncontemporary, and sometimes now it's translated with glamorous, which is not elegant at all. But that work, which is very rare, giving you the idea of the balance and multiplicity of these lashes and the composition that Fontana is able to do from 1959 to 1968. They do live together. I'm just close with this. I would not talk of painting. I never even refer to the works I did in 1946 as painting, but right from the outset, I call them spatial concept. And this is because painting, for me, it's entirely an idea. In the idea, I use and still use the canvas to record an idea. What I'm doing now are just variation of my two fundamental concepts, the cut and the hole. My creation of holes was radical as a gesture that shatters the space of the painting and declare, after this, we are free to do as we like. We cannot close the space of the picture within the limits of the canvas, for it must be extended out to all the space around it. So I think there's no way you can actually live Fontana in the limit of the perimeter of the canvas. I think this new space leave all Fontana space, and thank you for opening this incredible space with Fontana in London. Thank you.